Before the arrows, swords, and before any man raised a weapon, the earth itself had already decided who would die here. On July 22nd, 1298, the English crown rides out with the most expensive killing machine the medieval world had ever assembled. 500 kilograms of armored horse and armored man fused into a single weapon. A weapon that had broken kingdoms, shattered infantry lines from France to the Holy Land. A weapon that hadn't failed in living memory. But unfortunately, it failed here. And the reason it failed has nothing to do with tactics or courage. Matter of fact, it has nothing to do with the men who rode those horses. The reason is older than the battle, kingdom, and even older than the idea of war itself. It was written in the ground. For you to know what happened at Falkirk, you have to go back 10,000 years, to the end of the last ice age, and to the slow, silent catastrophe that the retreating glaciers left behind. When the ice pulled north, it didn't leave clean ground. It dragged with it an enormous cargo of pulverized rock, clay, silt, and it plastered that material across the lowlands of Scotland in layers so fine and so dense that water barely moves through them. The Scottish Central Belt sits on a geological foundation that was essentially designed to hold moisture. Rain falls, and it has nowhere to go. It doesn't drain or sink, but it accumulates. Over thousands of years, organic matter piled up on top of that clay. The surface layer became a sponge, and the clay beneath it became a seal. The result was a landscape that looked in summer perfectly passable. Firm turf, green grass, open ground. By the time Edward I marched north in the summer of 1298, weeks of rain had finished the job.
If you want to hear more stories like this, battles where strategy defeated strength, where the impossible became real, where one decision changed the course of nations, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of history.
The low ground between the two armies had crossed a threshold that soil scientists today would recognize immediately. A point of saturation where the material stops behaving like a solid and begins to behave like something else entirely. Not quicksand, not a swamp. Something more subtle and in many ways more dangerous. A surface that looked stable, and it is not. Here is what a cavalry charge actually is, stripped down to its mechanics. A fully armed destrier weighed between 600 and 700 kilograms. Add the knight, the armor, the saddle, the weapons, you're moving close to 800 kilograms of mass at speeds approaching 30 kilometers per hour. At the moment of impact with the ground, that mass doesn't land gently. The gallop creates a suspension phase, a brief moment where all four hooves leave the ground, followed by a four-leg strike that absorbs the full momentum of the body. Engineers studying equine biomechanics estimate that the dynamic force of that strike can reach 2 to 3 times the horse's static body weight, concentrated into a hoof contact area of roughly 100 to 150 square centimeters. On firm ground, that force transfers cleanly into the earth. The horse pushes back, the ground pushes forward, and the animal accelerates. This is traction. This is what makes cavalry devastating. On saturated clay, something different happens. The hoof strikes the surface, and the surface yields. Not dramatically, not like stepping into a river. It yields just enough. The leading edge of the hoof punches through the crust and into the waterlogged material below. The horse's momentum continues forward while the leg is momentarily anchored. Every single stride becomes a small, violent argument between the horse's body and the ground, and the horse loses every time, not catastrophically, not all at once, incrementally. Stride by stride, the animal is spending 2, 3, 4 times the muscular energy it would need on firm ground just to keep moving. It is being exhausted from the inside out, and there is nothing its rider can do about it. Here is something that rarely appears in military histories, but that any experienced horseman understands instinctively. Horses know bad ground. Not in the way a general reads a map or an engineer analyzes soil samples. They know it the way a living creature knows anything that threatens to break its legs. Viscerally, immediately, and with a certainty that no training can fully override. A destrier bred for war, conditioned since birth to charge into noise and chaos and the smell of blood, will still hesitate at ground that feels wrong beneath its hooves. It will shorten its stride, then drift, and it will slow. The destrier was bred specifically for size and power, which made it the most dangerous animal on the medieval battlefield and, on the wrong terrain, one of the most vulnerable. Its weight, the very thing that made it a weapon, became a liability the moment the ground lost the ability to support it. You cannot charge at speed across ground that is actively resisting every stride. You arrive at your enemy not as a wall of momentum, but as a collection of exhausted, destabilized animals. And exhausted, destabilized animals do not break infantry formations. What was actually happening inside that ground comes down to a concept called shear strength. Shear strength is the ability of a material to resist being deformed, to hold its shape under load rather than collapsing or sliding. Dry clay has reasonable shear strength. It can support significant weight. But clay is also made of extraordinarily fine particles that have a powerful relationship with water. As water content rises, those particles begin to act less like a solid mass and more like a suspension. The bonds between them weaken, the shear strength drops, and at a certain point, it drops so sharply that the material effectively loses its ability to support dynamic loads. They call it bearing capacity failure, the moment when a surface that appears solid simply stops being able to hold what's placed on it. The principles Edward I's cavalry encountered at Falkirk are the same principles that inform how we design roads, bridges, airstrips, and military logistics routes today. The ground at Falkirk was not an anomaly. It was the natural behavior of glacially deposited clay under saturation conditions. It just happened to be positioned directly between an English king and the Scottish army he intended to destroy. Edward I was not a stupid man. He was arguably the most capable military commander England had produced in 2 centuries. He understood what he was looking at when his cavalry commanders reported back. He understood that the ground between his army and Wallace's schiltrons was not going to cooperate. And so he did something that changed English military doctrine for the next generation. He pulled the cavalry back, he brought up his Welsh longbowmen, and he stood there on the edge of a battlefield defined by bad soil and chose arrows over horsemen. The schiltrons broke under the arrow storm. Wallace's army collapsed. Edward won. But the victory revealed something that could not be unseen, that the most expensive, most prestigious, most psychologically dominant weapon in medieval Europe was entirely at the mercy of conditions it could not control, on ground it could not choose. That was the crack in the myth of invincibility. And once you see a crack, you cannot unsee it. The greatest armies in history are not brought down by enemies alone. They are brought down by the invisible architecture of the world beneath their feet, by geology, by chemistry, by the slow, indifferent physics of the earth itself, which does not know your strategy and does not care about your cavalry, and has been here, quietly waiting, since long before anyone thought to ride a horse across it. The ground decides. It always has.